As Jake mentioned, tonight we're looking at the topic, why parables? I want to look at some of the reasons why Jesus used parables, why Jesus was going to use parables to teach, and also some of the lessons for us as we look at some of Jesus's parables. Hopefully we can use some of these lessons to help understand the parables a little bit more as we read and come across them in the Bible. Well, first though, we want to consider, what is a parable? Maybe you're not altogether familiar with this idea of a parable. Maybe you're familiar with parables that are found outside of the Bible. So we want to lay a bit of groundwork now in discussing what is a parable. Now, if we were to consider a modern definition of a parable, it's usually a simple story or perhaps a set of events that help teach a lesson. Now, that's what a parable is. It's got a hidden meaning below the surface. Now, in broad terms, a parable, it might be like a fable that you've heard before. Think of the tortoise and the hare, or the boy who cried wolf. Fables often use fantastical characters that can speak, that are like animals, to tell a moral or a story. Parables are similar to that, but they're a little bit different. There's a lot of similarities between the two, but one of the distinctions between a parable and a fable, especially with the parables of Jesus that he teaches in the Bible, one thing that sets them apart is that they are the authoritative words of eternal truth. Now, that's a bit lofty, so hopefully we'll explain that a little bit more as we continue on tonight. But essentially, when Jesus is preaching and teaching in parables, he's teaching about the kingdom of God. It's the king teaching concerning the kingdom of God to an audience, a group of believers that want to learn more about the kingdom of God. And so Jesus often begins his parables with, the kingdom of heaven is like unto, as we see on the screen here. The kingdom of heaven is like unto, and he goes into his parables. And hopefully we'll go into this a little bit more, but the kingdom of heaven is really just talking about the kingdom of God. So one of Jesus's parables is, the kingdom of heaven is like unto a man which sowed good seed. Now, all of Jesus's audience could relate to that. They could think about sowing seed upon the earth. Maybe they'd done it themselves, or perhaps they'd seen another individual sowing seed. Another one of Jesus's parables is, the kingdom of heaven is likened to a grain of mustard seed, something so very, very small. But later on in the parable, Jesus says it turns into something very large. Another one of his parables is, the kingdom of heaven is likened to leaven hid in measures of flour. There's treasure hid in a field and a merchant man seeking goodly pearls, that we're going to talk about later as we dig deeper into this topic. And finally, there's a net that was cast into the sea. All of these things are parables of Jesus that he uses to help expound and explain the meaning of what the kingdom of God is going to be like unto. They're things that the audience could relate to. Now, a normal parable or fable, it often tells us a moral, something thereby we can live the good life, you might say. But Jesus's parables, they go a little bit deeper than that. It's often been said that Jesus's parables are earthly stories with a heavenly meaning beneath the surface. Sometimes Jesus's parables, they actually do contain morals, something that we can immediately take out of the parable. We might think of the Good Samaritan, something that we can immediately apply to our lives. But with Jesus's parables, there's always something deeper beneath the surface, something that relates the parable to the teaching concerning the kingdom of God. So we're going to see tonight that parables were one of Jesus's most powerful teaching techniques, because they could convey so much more than just a simple instruction or command, which is what a lot of the people were used to because of the teaching of the scribes and the Pharisees. So why did Jesus speak in parables? Sometimes we have these questions and we come to the Bible and we have to sort of piece together an answer. But fortunately tonight, Jesus just tells us exactly why he spoke in parables. Now, it's not the most clear of answers, so we have to dig a little bit deeper into Jesus's words, but Jesus actually tells us why he specifically spoke in parables. We find the answer to this, as Jake mentioned, in Matthew chapter 13. This is the first chapter in the Bible, at least in the teachings of Jesus, that we get an in-depth look at parables. Now, some people look at the events of the Sermon on the Mount, perhaps you've heard of that, in Matthew's chapter 5, 6, and 7, and say that some of those are parables. Well, the ones in Matthew chapter 13 are the first ones specifically termed by Jesus as parables. So these are the ones we're going to consider tonight. And some of the ones on the screen, in fact, all the ones on the screen before you are parables from Matthew chapter 13. So in Matthew chapter 13, Jesus tells at least 7 parables and explains 2 of them in great detail. Now, the first parable, perhaps you've heard of the first one, it's the parable of the sower. There's a man who sows, and he takes his bag of seed and he walks across the property and he casts it. He casts it everywhere. And some falls on the wayside, some falls among thorns, some on the good ground. And depending on which ground it fell upon, well, the sower gets a different yield. Some of it doesn't grow up at all. Some of it gets eaten by birds, but some of it, well, it grows into a very fruitful crop. So when the audience hears this parable of Jesus, they could all think about it. They could imagine what it would be like to sow seed upon the ground, to be waiting for something to grow, and to be so rejoicing when it finally does grow. But you see, this parable was different than the teachings they'd heard before. You see, immediately after the parable, the disciples come up to Jesus and they ask him to explain the parable. No, this wasn't something that the disciples were accustomed to hearing. They weren't used to this form of teaching. It was a deeper form of teaching. The scribes and the Pharisees, well, they quoted a rabbi, they quoted a section from the Torah, and that was their teaching. But Jesus is using these parables. Before, Jesus had taught with a powerful simplicity. He taught them the Lord's Prayer, the Beatitudes. But now he's using these parables. And so even the disciples here can pick up on the fact that there's something going on beneath the surface. Jesus is using parables for a particular reason. In fact, even the words of Jesus at the end of the parable of the sower, he says, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Jesus is asking the audience to think and to hear and to listen to what he's saying, because there's more going on beneath the surface. So the disciples ask the very question you and I are asking tonight: why does Jesus speak in parables? Well, Jesus says from Matthew chapter 13, because it has been given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For whoever has, to him more will be given, and he will have abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. No, that's a whole lot. I mean, we were maybe just expecting a very simple answer like, well, I speak in parables, so this. But that's not what Jesus says. Jesus actually says he speaks in parables because he's speaking to 2 different groups of people simultaneously. So what do we mean by that? Well, Jesus is speaking parables because there's one group who actually cares what he's saying. They want to learn more. And so the parables are going to draw them in. They're going to intrigue the audience. They're going to ask the questions like the disciples did. Why are you saying these things? What do they mean? Help us understand. At the same time where there's that group, there's also another group, a group who doesn't want to hear what Jesus says. In fact, these are a group of people who actually want Jesus gone. They don't want to hear him ever again. So Jesus says he's speaking to 2 different groups of people. Now, that can be a little hard to come to terms with, right? We might think to ourselves, why would Jesus actually want to confuse someone? Would Jesus want to make it harder for someone to hear about the kingdom of God? Well, let's consider the context a little bit here. Matthew chapter 13, believe it or not, comes after Matthew chapter 12. What happens in Matthew chapter 12 is Jesus is teaching and preaching. And Jesus is also teaching, preaching, and healing on the Sabbath day. And that makes the scribes and the Pharisees, who had a different understanding of the import of the Sabbath, very mad. They don't like what Jesus is doing. They don't like what he's teaching. And so when we come to Matthew chapter 13, there's an audience built up of disciples who want to hear what Jesus is saying. And the other part of the audience is those who follow the scribes and the Pharisees, perhaps some of them themselves, who want Jesus gone. They're threatening Jesus is threatening their position as leaders to the people because Jesus is capturing the attention of the audience. So these are the 2 groups that Jesus is speaking to. Those who want to hear and those who don't want to hear at all. In fact, want Jesus to stop teaching. So to those who actually wanted to hear and learn about the kingdom of God, well, the parables that Jesus gives would help them to understand. It would give them a simple story in their life that they could connect his teachings and ideas to. It would help them remember the principles and the lessons that Jesus was giving. But to those who didn't want to hear, to those who were stopping their ears and didn't want to hear what Jesus said, well, the parables would perhaps just confuse them. They would wonder, why is he telling these simple stories? What is he actually trying to say? Because they didn't want to hear, they wouldn't dig deeper. They wouldn't ask Jesus what he's saying. And so they would be confused by what Jesus was teaching. Now, this wasn't just a teaching technique that Jesus thought up of on the fly. This was something that the Old Testament talked about as well, something that the Old Testament showed would be a powerful way to get people to learn. In fact, the verses here, or at least a portion of them, are actually Jesus quoting from an Old Testament prophet, the prophet Isaiah. Now, Isaiah was preaching likewise to a nation that didn't want to hear what God said. And so the prophet Isaiah prophesied, "Hearing you will hear and shall not understand, and seeing you will see and not perceive. For the hearts of this people have grown dull. Their ears are hard of hearing. Their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, lest they should understand with their hearts and turn so that I should heal them." So just like the prophet Isaiah preaching to the nation of Israel before captivity, well, Jesus is preaching to the nation of Israel who don't want to hear what God has to say. By way of parables, Jesus would gain the interest of those who are actually interested. And by way of parables, well, those who didn't care to hear what Jesus said would not hear the message. Those who desired to know more would be blessed in their understanding. They would be able to come up to Jesus, to his disciples, and to learn more about the kingdom of God and to remember it through these parables. But those who didn't care to hear, they'd go without. They were self-satisfied with their own lives. They didn't want to be taught by this carpenter's son. And so as we consider the parables, we see that Jesus told parables to challenge his hearers, to consider whether they wanted to submit to his teaching about the kingdom of God or not. Many resisted the invitation that Jesus gave in the parables, but others embraced it and were motivated to live their lives in a way that would be acceptable according to the hope that they had. The same challenge, friends, is there for you and I when we read Jesus's parables. Are we going to hear, or are we going to harden our hearts and not hear what Jesus has to say? But it's not just the prophet Isaiah that Jesus seems to be alluding to. There's a wonderful proverb that I think applies very well to what Jesus is saying here in Matthew chapter 13. The proverb says, "It's the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings is to search out a matter." Friends, some of the parables, they're much more simple than others. Some of the parables, Jesus actually tells us exactly what they mean. There's no need to guess or to search further. Some of the parables have their interpretation in the Old Testament. We actually have to go back to the Old Testament to find out why Jesus used certain figures and examples in his parables. But friends, all of the parables of Jesus should make us stop and think, should make us want to search out the matters before us. Because within the parables of Jesus are hidden the wonderful details of the kingdom of God and the hope contained therein. Now it's up to the hearer. In Jesus' day, it was the disciples, the multitudes. Today, it's you and I to hear the message and to search it out. So the question for you and I is, do we have ears to hear?